So, kicking off real world AI and automation use cases for business leaders. So, the presentation is going through different degrees of information. We're going to be pretty high level. Not going to be suggesting specific products necessarily. It's relatively product agnostic. We're going to talk about things that we've seen in the field, and the goal of this presentation is not to make you an engineer or an AI expert. It's just to show you what's possible, what we've seen kind of firsthand, and useful ways to think about how this could apply to your own organization. And so we're covering a lot in a little bit of time, and there will be time for questions as well. But if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll answer them kind of periodically, and then we'll have kind of a dedicated time at the end for questions as well. And thank you to everybody who took the survey. As Gabrielle mentioned, there is a link in the chat to the survey if you feel like providing input there. So diving in, as they mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Easie. Who are we? We're an organization that does custom AI and automation solutions that turn ideas into tangible business outcomes. And so we've worked in about 40 different industries in these implementation focused projects. And it's been a really interesting kind of seeing the extreme interest that has come up in AI. And as I mentioned, we've been working in the field since 2018. So we were kind of working in AI systems before it was cool, and pre-chat GPT, and back then we were calling it machine learning more often. And so we've seen a lot of use cases even beyond just large language models. So we've done a lot of work in things like computer vision as well. And so it's more to say for sure, but we've worked in the private sector, public sector, the nonprofit sector, and there's just major opportunity kind of all over the sort of spectrum of industries. And so with that, going to go further into the presentation. These are just some of the clients we've worked with. We're based in the United States. We've worked kind of throughout the country, again, sort of across the board. So we've got our agenda here that I'll dive into. And as I mentioned, the goal of this session is really to give you real world practical examples of use cases that we've seen with real organizations in the past. There's a lot of different tools that exist for automation, AI, and sort of the distinction between AI and automation. We'll go over some of those today, again, with sort of the emphasis being we're not necessarily going to suggest specific products. We're not affiliated with any of these products, et cetera. But the key kind of takeaway is that AI and automation can significantly save time, reduce manual work, and keep your team focused. There's productivity tools, and then there's ways to actually apply these tools more broadly to processes. So a lot more to say there, but there's sort of this distinction between AI and automation that we'll talk about. So as I mentioned, there was a survey that occurred before this presentation, and the results were fascinating. One of the things that we saw is that about 71% of you are using basic tools, so things like ChatGPT, Claude, Zapier, et cetera. And about 14% of you are exploring more customized solutions, and about 14% haven't started yet. What's also fascinating is that a lot of the pain points were similar in terms of data entry, interacting with customers, generating documents, et cetera. And I'd say a key insight here besides that is that about 37% of you were worried about reliability and accuracy of the data, and about 40% of you do not have an AI policy in place for your business. And so we'll cover both of those today. But the key insight here was that most of the attendees are using these basic tools, but lack formal policies and worry about reliability. And so pretty broad sort of representation of different types of organizations here, with the majority being VPs and directors, and about 50% having about 11 to 50 employees. Quite interesting, and a lot more to say there. So again, this isn't meant to be like a death by PowerPoint kind of situation, so I'm not going to read the slides necessarily, but the goal of this slide and this presentation, which will be shared with everybody, is to give you a little bit of a framework to think about these things. You've got these two different categories of AI and automation, and often these systems are working together. So automation is more kind of your traditional software, traditional algorithms, data moving from one place to another, and systems that are kind of integrated and talking to each other. These systems are more based on predefined rules, and they do the exact same thing every single time. They're sort of very reliably doing activities that are if this then that sort of situation. Um, so, for example, like submitting a form on a website could be an example. It is only able to do exactly what you design it for. Versus AI, we've all kind of seen it with some of the tools that we're using, but these systems can be a little more kind of broad in terms of being able to handle unstructured data, being able to adapt to slightly different scenarios. They can understand sort of natural language in a way that it can more broadly handle different use cases. The system can be improved over time with new data and iterative feedback, and it can be applied to a large variety of use cases. And the key thing here is depending on how you configure it, you can have variance in what the actual outputs look like. And so that's where some of that reliability concern comes into place. There's ways to configure these systems, though, which we'll talk about, which can improve the sort of predictability of outcomes. Um, so then moving further into this, so a few different ways to think about this. When you're looking at implementing tools like this, one of the first things we suggest doing is doing an audit of your operations, doing a sort of review of what it is that your organization's doing and being able to say kind of more clearly, does this make sense? Is there areas within my workflow that we can apply these types of tools? And when you're thinking about these things, you've got sort of the process itself, and then for each step in the process, are there opportunities to use technology? Oftentimes, when you do this sort of end-to-end review, you can sometimes see, okay, the process itself needs to be improved before we start applying technology to it. So there's a few different things you can ask yourself. How often you're spending time on things like manual entry, interacting with customers on repetitive questions, et cetera. Are you manually moving data between systems? And if you documented your workflows, could somebody who is sort of less experienced see it and do it themselves? So there's a few things that, like, if you're seeing kind of repetitive manual steps or systems aren't talking to each other, these are some signals that you might be able to benefit from automation. Um, and so when you're thinking about these things, there's sort of broad categories when we're talking about AI and automation. When we're talking about these different tools, they sort of fall into these 5 buckets. So you can um, use AI for creating content. And we're going to go into specific use cases, but creating content, generating content that you can share with others. You can think about this like marketing or documents, etc. Answer and assist. This is things like Q&A, chat bots that can answer questions, especially repetitive questions, and can provide customer support, as well as sort of handling FAQ type scenarios. Sorting and scanning, so quickly reviewing and organizing documents or data and that are sort of meeting a pattern or a category. So you can think about it like, classifying specific data and putting it in different categories and being able to analyze it on a broader level. So being able to search documents with natural language, for example. Automating admin. This is one that we've seen be very sort of high impact in terms of value that businesses are seeing, where you're taking processes that were previously done manually and then you're having them be done in an automated basis. So you can think about like extracting data from a document as an example. And then learn and decide. This one's kind of fascinating. You're seeing kind of learning systems where people are able to sort of collaboratively interact with AI systems in a way that they can learn things, they can help make decisions, they can strategically think about things, and it's almost like a buddy that you're talking to that can help you kind of go back and forth. And on a high level, again, 71% of you mentioned you're using things like ChatGPT already or Claude. Um, and some of you may have been exposed to things like Claude Cowork, for example, which is a great sort of collaborative tool for sort of this buddy system kind of interaction. And the goal here is to kind of go beyond those sort of out of the box productivity tools and talk about different things that we've seen. Some of you, I'm sure, are using Copilot as well, which has its place in this conversation. But on a high level, this is sort of 5 different buckets you can think about for thinking about these things. Moving on. So again, we're talking about an operational audit. What is it that you're going to do before you actually start doing pilot projects? If you don't do this, we've seen people sometimes get into situations where they're in what we call pilot project purgatory, where they are doing things and you sort of feel like you're doing stuff, but you're not necessarily improving in sort of your productivity or in sort of your operational excellence, if you will. And really focusing on prioritizing these findings that you have and focusing on the highest priority ones is critical. And so we created this framework. We called it the Easy Pain Point Prioritization Matrix. I swear I will limit the buzzwords in this meeting, but you've got this matrix where you've got impact and frequency. So the highest priority tasks should be these high impact, high frequency tasks. And so you're looking at things that you're doing all the time that are critical to your operation. And so that varies wildly depending on what your organization is. And doing this audit can help you sort of uncover these pain points. And then when you're going into high impact, low frequency, or low impact, high frequency, those are sort of the medium priority. And then you've got the low impact, low frequency, those are the lower priority. And again, the low priority tasks are sometimes the ones that feel cool to do, but they don't necessarily push the needle. And sometimes the most sort of dry, for lack of a better word, boring tasks are the ones that actually have the highest impact, things like data entry, et cetera. So you've got this pain point prioritization matrix. This is just a fancy way of saying, what are your hair on fire problems? Only you know this. The hair on fire problems are something that varies again between organizations, but I'm sure we've all been this guy on the right over here where you're trying to live your best life, you're trying to get stuff done, and you're struggling. You've got too much to do, not enough time to do it, and you're doing repetitive tasks manually. There's a comment in the chat about a recording. There is a recording of the class that is being achieved. So if you have to jump, no worries. And so again, that's just to say, hair on fire problems, what is it? Got to ask yourself that question and use this prioritization matrix to do that. And so again, attack those really sort of high intensity problems that you have. And it is something that you can do sort of collaboratively with your team. Oftentimes we find that when people feel empowered to think about things this way, these sort of ideas can bubble up from different layers of the organization. So this isn't purely just a leadership kind of question to do. Having people be sort of empowered to be involved at different layers can actually lead to really sort of high impact results. Okay, so now let's dive into some use cases. So these are things that we've actually seen be really effective. And so I'm going to start with one that I think was sort of obvious to people when ChatGPT was released back in 2022. Everybody, I think, sort of, you don't have to use your imagination too much to kind of think about chatbots. We all see different chatbots. There's all kinds of different solutions that exist. But what's really interesting about this is these tools have evolved quite heavily, where you've got chatbots that can be installed on your website with a single line of code. So you can have these things that are sort of public facing, and they can be fully customized to your brand voice, specific knowledge that you have. It can answer questions based on your documentation or your website or other sort of composite materials that you have. And what's interesting about this is you'll find people often ask the same questions on your website. So we have a client, for example, that we installed a chatbot for, and they found that 70% of the questions people were asking were related to their products and services. And they were getting those questions answered immediately. It gave them some links of like, if you want this service, go to this page. And they found their sales increased about 25% just from installing a sort of 24/7 chatbot. You can go a step further, though, beyond just question answering. You can have chatbots that you can configure it so that when somebody asks a specific question, you can collect information from a form. So you can think about like, somebody asks you something specific of the chatbot, and then an actual form appears with a series of questions, intake questions, et cetera, or contact information requested. And so you can actually have these things be sort of dynamic. It could just be, if they ask more than 3 questions, get their email address and their name before you keep chatting. But it could also be if they ask about an order issue, or if they ask about a specific type of product, you ask them these specific questions. So it's quite interesting. Um, Pretty sort of high octane use case. That's public facing. The other thing that's super fascinating is you're starting to have the advent of agents, which go beyond sort of the chatbot functionality where it can actually do things. It could interact with your CRM. It could have sort of widgets that appear for scheduling and other kind of more data driven activities, and be a little more dynamic in sort of what it's empowered to do. You can also have these things so that they escalate to a person, depending on what's being requested. And I encourage you to really think about if this is useful for your team, and to sort of look beyond just some of these out of the box tools. One of the things that I'll say too is that besides um, these sort of public facing tools, if any of you have applications or customers that sign into a portal, et cetera, you can also have these agent tools be used to interact with people on a more kind of personalized basis. So you could say, hey, I'm signed into the application here. And so the AI agent will be able to know who it's talking to. It'll be able to say, like, I know you're John Smith. I know that you ordered this information, or I know this information about you from maybe the CRM. And it's able to kind of have a little bit more of like a personalized data driven interaction. But these internal or like authentic, like post authenticated chatbots are becoming more and more kind of interesting as well. And so, enough said, chatbots, not necessarily the sort of uh, most abstract use case, but a use case nonetheless, and something that people are getting a lot of value out of. Um, and so, yeah, moving on from this use case two. This is another one where again I'm seeing this be really sort of common use case. People can use AI to create content. And on a high level, you can think about this like you're creating marketing materials, you're creating content based on sort of specific activities that you're trying to do. So this can be useful for creating reports, for helping you sort of speed up things like writing newsletters. And again, you can train these things to have brand specific voice, words, tone, and messaging. Um, and you can have it work in different languages. One of the things that I'll say is that oftentimes, if you're finding an AI system is producing results that sound bad or look bad from a content standpoint, oftentimes it's because you're either not prompting it with specific enough language, or you're not giving it enough examples. And so if you're just kind of asking it to do something without any examples, that's called zero shot prompting. And you can actually, if you give it a couple examples and say, like, use these examples and speak in this brand voice, that's called few shot prompting. And then it can actually lead to a significantly better results. Also, if you're using a tool like Google Gemini, for example, and really if you're using large language models in general, there's a setting called temperature that is a number between 0 and 2. By default, most of these things are set to 1. But if you lower the temperature so it's lower than 1, so if you make it zero 0.5 or even 0 or 0.1, you can have it be a little more kind of exactly following your instructions. And so temperature isn't something that you can control from every tool, like Copilot or ChatGPT, like doesn't necessarily let you do that unless you're using sort of their what's called their API. But long story short, give it examples, give it information that you want it to know when it's sort of thinking about these things. So say, like, don't use these words or don't use an M dash. It can be really helpful because personalization can deliver 5 to 8% or 5 to 8x higher return on investment for communications activities. And additionally, it can speed up things like reporting that are often very sort of predictably structured. One thing to mention is that we are in a state of technology where it's very easy to clone people's voices or to create sort of clones from a video standpoint. You can do what's called deep faking. I'm sure we've all seen that. We're in sort of this dystopian present a little bit in some ways with how that looks. So just consider kind of the ethical considerations of creating deep fakes, and only create a deep fake of somebody if you have their permission. All right. So then use case 3, super interesting stuff. Custom portals and applications. So again, this is more on the automation side, but one of the things that we're finding that is really interesting is we're seeing people really benefit from having an interface that is customized to their business use case. So you might be using Salesforce or HubSpot or Airtable or Monday for kind of where your data actually lives. But oftentimes, the ability to have a portal where you can interact with the data, where you can see sort of specific interfaces on your phone or on your desktop, and you can actually see these things kind of more specific to your application, to your business use case. That can be a huge value add. Because again, using something like Salesforce out of the box, even if your data is living in there, we hear it all the time where people are like, we want to be able to have an app that's built on top of this. And so there's all kinds of AI features that you can build, but the data ultimately is living in something like a Salesforce. But you can create, applications with all kinds of mapping and it's not just kind of tables of data, it can have forms, et cetera. And so this is a similar thing where your customers may benefit from being able to sign into a portal. Your internal team may benefit from being able to sign into a portal. Portals definitely, really kind of useful, slept on type of situation. So yeah, when we're talking about this, you can have sort of this document use case. A lot more to say there, but these things are extremely customizable, and so being able to build a portal that is sort of unique to your use case, all kinds of ways you can sort of think about that. But it's not a website, it's not sort of a third party tool, but it's something that is built for your specific use case. And as a side point, one of the things that we're really seeing is that people are moving away from these sort of rigid third party out of the box software systems, and they're moving much more towards this kind of stuff. And so this is different from what you may have seen called vibe coding, where people with sort of no coding background or no engineering background are sort of having AI generate apps and sort of like don't fully understand what they're saying. What this is saying is that because people are able to sort of collaboratively use AI for engineering processes, you've got people that are building software that are completely unique to their use case. And what's fascinating about this is you can have, 70, 80, 90% cost savings if you do something like this, as opposed to if any of you are using Salesforce, not trying to beat up on Salesforce, but if any of you were using something like that, you can sort of sympathize with the extreme cost that goes along with that. It's super fascinating in sort of the sort of larger kind of software community. Even in the stock market, you'll notice that things like Salesforce, Adobe, Monday, et cetera, their stocks are down 30-40% this year. And I think that, a big part of that is this understanding that a custom application is often much better than sort of these rigid out of the box tools. So again, this is more of an automation use case, but it can be sort of hand in hand with AI. Use case 4, this is a heavy hitting use case, even though it is sometimes considered a little more dry. And document processing, so extracting data from a document or an image, is actually a really sort of high frequency use case. So back office automation, sort of that automate admin use case that I brought up, is quite high impact. So we've seen teams that are processing, in some cases, thousands of documents a month, or they've got their customers submitting documents, or they've got documents coming in. It might be things like legislative text, it might be things like tax returns or compliance documents, and you can use fine-tuned AI models to extract the data in a structured format. So you could have documents coming in from email, from DocuSign, etc. You extract the data that's fine-tuned to your specific use case, and then you can push it to other systems. So you can push it to things like Salesforce, to your custom database, to SAP, to HubSpot, QuickBooks even. And it's really interesting because in some cases, if the document is sort of structured in a certain way, you can reduce data entry by up to 99%. So this is quite a heavy hitting use case if you are interacting with a lot of documents. What's also cool about this is, in addition to being able to say like, okay, we're extracting data in a structured format. If it says this on this document, we need to take that out, put it somewhere, whatever. You can also have more kind of qualitative results where it's like, okay, this document says this stuff. What's the interpretation of it? So you can have classification as well, where you could, basically be sort of having the AI model have a conclusion based on the documents. So this could be a document, this could be somebody filling out a form where they're submitting sort of this unstructured data. But you can have these sort of intake processes where the AI will sort of be able to make judgments that can then be used downstream for things like creating proposals, creating documents, creating reports, or just automating a compliance function. We had a client that were processing thousands of documents per year related to a compliance exercise, and they had a whole sort of compliance team doing that. And through this type of process, their compliance team was able to sort of focus on higher impact use cases. And what I'll say about this is that anecdotally, when people are doing these exercises where they're automating things or using AI, they are not they are not firing people or laying off their teams. We're often finding that the team just gets repurposed for something, or they end up doing higher sort of impact use cases. I'm sure some of you saw a study that came out a day or two ago that the Wall Street Journal reported on, where it was a very sort of high level, big sample size study that actually found that AI sort of intensifies work as opposed to sort of makes people obsolete. So people are just doing more in less time as opposed to being displaced. And a lot more to say philosophically about that, but I think some of the like tech companies that are saying they're laying people off because of AI, it's kind of more of a convenient excuse. Um, so it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's just to say that I think the mass document processing use case is quite interesting. There's a lot that can be done with this. You can think about documents, you can think about images as well. There's a lot you can do with sort of fine tuning these things for this type of use case. But taking some data, doing something with it, it should go without saying that you don't always need to prompt a system to do this kind of stuff. So this could be a layer built into your business processes that when there's a trigger of some sort, something happens, you're then able to act on it and look at it kind of in a little more detail and, sort of do something with it automatically without a person having to say like, okay, like press the button, have it do something. So these userless systems that just sort of operate in the background are quite powerful. The only other thing I'll say is that for the most part, with these automated systems or with these AI driven activities, most of the time these are semi automated systems. So it's not like people are completely out of the loop. And depending on what you're doing, you do want to have human in the loop for these different activities. So when you're doing things like extracting data from documents, if you have a huge variation in documents and like what they look like, so, for example, we did a project where a client was processing like 10,000 invoices per month, and every invoice looked different. The format varied dramatically. Sometimes there was handwriting on it. You can have it so that when these systems are extracting data, there is actually like a confidence that is applied to the extraction. So it can say like, I'm only 56% sure that this information says something. Or that this information like says this value, and you can make it so that if it's below a certain confidence threshold, it goes to a person, et cetera. And sort of more broadly, the higher consequence the decision, the more you really want to consider having a person in there to kind of check the output. And so again, sometimes you're just talking about speeding things up. Other times you're able to purely automate something. But the people that are saying AI can, do 100% of a process without any supervision, oftentimes the claim is a little dubious unless it's like a super sort of simplified use case. So definitely, when you're thinking about these things, it's not necessarily the goal to just not have people be touching this stuff. It's more just to reduce the amount of clicks or the amount of inputs and the amount of manual repetitive work that you might be doing to get this in there. So, extracting is one thing, but again, interpretation is another kind of unique area where you can have this happening. One of the other things that I'll say is that, again, not to really go into any specific product suggestions, but one of the things that I will say sort of anecdotally from the field, you've got your different sort of machine learning systems that are kind of single use cases, like some of these computer vision tools that I'm talking about. But when we're talking about large language models, for the most part, for actual production facing use cases where you've got these kind of userless systems, we're seeing people using Gemini for the most part. For people having more of these productivity tools and interacting with, like a large language model more as like a coworker, we are seeing people using kind of Claude and the Anthropic suite more often, especially Claude Cowork and Claude Code. Sort of a really high impact thing. But for kind of these business applications like these chatbots and these sort of high volume things, Gemini has generally been the most useful. It has kind of the most sort of tooling around it and the ability to do things that some of these other models can't do. So it's not to say that ChatGPT or OpenAI doesn't have a place in sort of this ecosystem, but we're seeing a trend kind of away from the OpenAI tools towards the sort of Gemini and Anthropic tools. And again, some of you may be in this sort of Microsoft environment where Copilot is a thing, and that is the situation. And with Microsoft tools, that actually can be fine. Okay, so yeah, again, you can see this sort of extracting data from documents. So like this was a use case where there was an interface and people were uploading these invoices, and you can see it's sort of extracting the data in real time, and you're able to see kind of this data right away. So enough said. I think I've kind of made the document use case quite clear. And again, you can do this. You can do this with images as well. So it's not always just like PDFs. Being able to process video streams, all kinds of things you can do. So the next thing I would say is sort of related to this, classification of data in files and images. I talked about this a little just now. This is this sort of image that you're seeing here on the right. There's sort of two separate things happening. One, this was like a computer vision thing we did where it was analyzing if someone was wearing PPE. Sort of topical and relevant when we did that back in the day. But this concept that you can say like this person's wearing a hard hat or this person's doing something in this video image, you can see all kinds of applications for this. You could use it for things like testing or seeing if there's a fire happening, which the state of California is doing that for forest fire detection, which is quite fascinating. You can also use it for defect detection in a manufacturing context. So images are one thing, but again, you can do this with text too. So you can see here on the left, this is what an output might look like from a moderation system where data, documents, etc., are passing through a moderation layer, and it's saying like, does this contain sexual imagery? Does this contain hate speech? Does this contain sort of violent material? You can use this, especially if you're dealing with like public comments from users, or if you're dealing with sort of large submissions of material, you can sort of use it for a moderation use case. But also, it can be used for kind of less sort of moderation things. You can use it for things like we had a client that they were like a museum, and they were trying to basically they had all these documents going back to the 1800s, and they wanted to classify them into different buckets. And so you can think about all kinds of classification use cases. It's quite interesting and quite cool. And again, you could have something like, oh, some legislation just came out. Is this related to my advocacy initiative, for example? You can see if something's good or bad in terms of sentiment. All kinds of things you can do with classification. And this is like another pretty heavy hitting use case that we're seeing. There's a special note that I want to emphasize here, and this is something that generally most AI models are capable of doing. So you got the big three, whatever, you got your sort of OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic tools, but you also have a lot of open source tools that can do this as well. And definitely I want to give a little shout out to open source tools, because oftentimes they perform equivalent or better in some cases than some of these closed source models. But in terms of reliability on the data, I talked a little bit about the temperature parameter, and the goal of this presentation, again, isn't to make you an engineer, but it's to say that there's certain sort of parameters that you can set so that the model is producing much more sort of predictable outputs every time. So I just wanted to give a special shout out to what's called structured outputs, where an AI model can be configured to return what's called a JSON object, or like a data object that is very structured, where it can be then be processed downstream by other software. So oftentimes, when you're talking to something like a chat GPT, it's just giving you text back. But you might want something to give you something that's like a lot more structured. So for example, you've got this text here where it says, my name is Sarah Johnson. I'm 34 years old and work as a software engineer. I specialize in Python, machine learning, and cloud infrastructure. You might want it to come back with their name, their age, their occupation, and their skills. And you can see this on the right here, this sort of structured object. Um, this will not just happen sort of spontaneously by accident. You would need to have it be configured for structured outputs, and you would need to feed the sort of schema to it. And again, not to go into a whole engineering use case, but use temperature and structured outputs to make your results more reliable. Low temperature and the use of structured outputs, you will get a lot more what's called deterministic results, especially if it's sort of configured properly with examples and stuff. All right. So similar to the classification and extraction of data, you can also use these systems for analyzing large volumes of data or documents. You might be a nonprofit, for example, where you're doing sort of grant making. You might have a 300-page grant application, and you can see here on the right, this is an example where like this was a grant that was issued by the government, and you're able to see more clearly, and you're able to kind of chat with documents. And you can do this with some of the out of the box tools like Claude, where you give it a document and you're able to say, hey, like, am I eligible for this? Like, this is what my nonprofit does. So you can use it for analyzing reports, you can use it for research, and you can use it for large data sets. So these systems that can interact with spreadsheets as well, and are quite sort of savvy at doing this sort of analysis. What's also cool about this is that these AI tools have the capability to write their own code and sort of use that for analysis. So when you're talking to like a Claude, for example, it's actually using code to interact with the spreadsheet as opposed to like the AI models just like reading it. It's quite interesting. I will say this, that if you're getting into large document use cases, like again, a 300-page grant document, things like ChatGPT are not good at doing that out of the box. So you've got what's called retrieval augmented generation, where you want to basically set it up so that it's able to handle these larger documents through what's called chunking. So again, not trying to go too much into the weeds on that, but out of the box, some of these large language models sort of struggle with long documents. I'm sure if you've ever uploaded like a really long document, you can see where it sort of struggles with that. I will give a special shout out to Google's Notebook LM tool. That is sort of, it uses Gemini, but it's got a lot of kind of interesting tooling where you can upload large documents, etc. And it can do things like create a podcast or create a sort of webinar around it. It's a little sort of meta talking about a webinar, but it can create a webinar. And again, we're not affiliated with any of these tools. A lot of these productivity tools that are large language model sort of supported are where a lot of these use cases will be for you. But then getting into kind of more advanced use cases, you have kind of more configuration required than just signing into these productivity tools. Someone just said, a use case I see now with AI is for the political field, where individuals are volunteering their time to lead a city, county, or bigger. They have 1,000 pages of policy and new laws to read and analyze for the next meeting. This is great. That's actually a great point. We actually have a slide about this later, but we've seen AI tools be used for government affairs, legislative tracking, et cetera. And it's a fantastic sort of use case where you can use it for analyzing policy, but you can also use it for seeing if policy is relevant to what you're doing specifically. We see that a lot for the nonprofit sector, and you can use automation tools to scrape a legislative sort of session. When new bills are released, you can have it go through an AI layer automatically. So it's not even like you necessarily need to know when a bill comes out, because it'll just check for you. So again, it's AI and automation working together. It's quite interesting. And I'm sure you can imagine you can use this for other things too, like RFPs, if you're interacting with sort of the state and federal contracting systems. Yeah, great point, Gemma. Okay. So then just mentioned this, so won't talk in as much detail about this, but government affairs. You can use it not only for analyzing bills and for sort of the actual advocacy work, but you can use it for actually creating sort of the downstream toolkits like issue briefs, action alerts, social media toolkits, etc. And again, we're talking about government affairs, but you can also use it for PR. And as a complete side point, what I want to say too is that especially in this world of AI, a lot of businesses are sort of historically, they've sort of slept on PR as a way to get publicity. But we've seen PR be a hugely useful tool. So you can use AI to create things like a press release, but you can also use tools like deep research. And that's actually a specific term that all of these AI tools have. Where, and again, shout out to sort of the Anthropic suite and Claude Cowork and sort of Claude itself, arguably the best one if you're using it as a coworker. But you can use something called deep research, where it can actually look at the internet, it can analyze and create a report for you. So you can find journalists that are relevant to what it is that you're doing as a business. It can be a great source of publicity. This was before AI was like a sort of really popular thing, but we got one of our clients in the Wall Street Journal, and they got 8 million views, and then they got featured on LinkedIn News, and it ended up producing a pretty significant financial return for them. And so it's just to say that you can use AI not just for this government affairs and lobbying use case, which probably only applies to a small percentage of you, but you can also use it for PR, and this sort of ties into that content creation uh, situation. All right. So this one's definitely near and dear to us, similar to analyzing large data sets, but I'm sure many of us have been this character on the right here, where you need a spreadsheet to keep track of your other spreadsheets. Painful. We've all been there. Spreadsheets are holding up the entire US financial system. Um, and this is just a super common use case where you have organizations with large decentralized data sets using spreadsheets heavily for business critical tasks, really hard to analyze. You've got data duplication between departments and nothing being updated in real time. Huge problem. And it's a situation where it's harder to actually apply AI when you've got sort of systems like this. And so, again, this is sort of when you're talking about doing an assessment for your business, this might be a hair on fire problem for you that you have to interact with these spreadsheets every day. So having a data centralization initiative is, it can be a little painful, but it's something that is oftentimes hugely helpful. And it's one of the number one pain points that we hear is like, hey, our data is not in a place that we can even use AI for it, or our data is not in a place that's structured. We need a database of some sort, and it's all over the place in terms of these spreadsheets. We had a client that had a spreadsheet. It had like a million rows in it, and they were calling it the database. And it was like very formula heavy. It was legacy. The person that originally created it didn't work there anymore. And it took like a few minutes to load when they showed it to me, and I was like, I'm scared. And it was one day they like messed up a formula, or like a row or a column got deleted, and it was like a crisis. And so spreadsheets, besides the fact that it can be sort of unwieldy in terms of your data being all over the place, it's not super reliable for sort of high priority business applications. So it's all just to say centralize your data, etc. And then when you do that, you can actually use more kind of algorithmic based analysis for reporting, etc. So we were just working with a nonprofit a few days ago that they had this reporting that they needed to do, and they had this data export that was sort of structured, but then they had to process that manually into a report. And we were able to use an AI tool it was Claude Cowork, and it was to be able to actually create this report, which was also a spreadsheet output. And it did it reliably. We double checked it. We went through with a fine tooth comb and double checked it, and it was completely accurate. So again, the quality of the data that you're putting in really sort of lends itself to higher quality data going out. And so getting the data in order is super helpful. The other thing that I would say too that's sort of slept on that is sometimes not always considered is that, and we'll talk a little bit more about testing later in the presentation, but when we're talking about um, like generating outputs with AI, especially if you're using proprietary data or if you're fine tuning an AI system with your data, you really want to do an impact assessment and check for algorithmic bias and really try and find edge cases before you deploy it to the public or into the wild. And this is where this ties into to high consequence decision making, and you know having a human be in the loop for really important things. So you see this legislatively, even though it's sort of kind of the trend is going away from AI regulation, but you see this sort of desire legislatively for people to have impact assessments be required. But you can have the case where you've seen these really high priority use cases where AI models can show signs of discrimination. It can show, kind of racism in the sort of use case, and it turns out the training data kind of had problems. And so if you're using AI systems for things like hiring decisions, deciding if someone should get a loan or if deciding if someone should get like a criminal sentence, like these are things where you really want to have human in the loop for that kind of final decision making. And using impact assessments is one way to do that. I can share some tools about this, but there's a bunch of free tools that exist. And ultimately, I think you will see more regulation around this. But that was a long-winded way of saying get out of the spreadsheet purgatory, get into a centralized data scheme, and then it's much easier to use AI kind of more broadly for this large-scale data analysis. Um, good stuff. Good stuff. We've all been this character over here. Okay, this one is really interesting, and um, I'm surprised that not that many people do this, but you can use computer vision tools to analyze what people are doing on your websites and your applications. So this screenshot shows a tool called Microsoft Clarity. This is a completely free tool that you can use. And there's other tools that are paid, like Full Story, that exist that have slightly richer features. But for the majority of you guys, this Microsoft Clarity can be a really great use case. And so what it's doing is it's not recording sessions, but what it's doing is doing a session replay where, based on how the people are interacting with code, it is basically recreating their session in a way that's privacy controlled, so you're not seeing data that they're entering or anything like that. Where you're able to see, like in this screenshot, for example, a heat map of what people are doing on your website. So this can be especially useful, again, if you have a custom portal or an application where users have to sign in. But oftentimes it's like, oh, I can see that this thing that I spent all this time working on, no one's actually using it, or no one's going to this page. We had a client that was using a tool like this, and they had this like really important feature that they were like super stoked about, and we analyzed it, and only like 1% of users were even getting to it, because we realized that the information architecture of the website was such that the feature was buried. The feature was actually trapped in this like subsection of the application. And so just simple understanding of like, oh, people aren't actually even making it there. They were ultimately able to change the structure so that their usage went up. So if you don't know what people are doing on your website or on one of your applications, it's more difficult to even see like, is my website even helping me here for like converting people or for kind of getting people to do what I want them to do. Microsoft Clarity, completely free. It's a cookie. So check that out. It's quite interesting, and there's some AI features that kind of go along with this. But yeah, and again, there's more you can say about this, but I would say that like everybody's got a website basically, and um, even if you're kind of a more traditional business, like this can really be helpful for understanding how to sort of optimize your information architecture, if you will. Okay. Um, Use case 10, AI enabled lead generation and cold outreach. So, for better or for worse, we're in a world where outbound marketing is required for a lot of businesses, at least. You know, we all love word of mouth growth. We all love inbound, where we're getting sort of traffic coming towards us. But for better or for worse, we're in this world where cold email, cold calling, even, and other types of outreach um, are quite popular. It is what it is. In sort of this post-COVID world, almost everybody is doing some type of digital marketing where it involves outbound communication. And there's been a lot of improvement in sort of the tooling around being able to do that. And so I'm sure some of you that receive cold emails are noticing that they're a little more personalized. It's like, wow, how do they know this stuff on my website? It goes without saying that nobody is actually writing this personalized content. They're 100% using AI for that. And it's definitely a situation where, when done right, it can at least be less annoying to read as a person receiving it. But it's a situation where if you don't personalize, you're way less likely to have it be read. And so there's tools that you can use to kind of do lead sourcing and enrichment. So I'm sure some of you have seen things like LinkedIn Sales Navigator, Apollo, Clay, even though Clay is quite expensive, and things like ListKit, Seamless. Like there's all kinds of these repositories for leads. And there's also, again, with sort of web scraping systems, there's ways to do some automation around this, and even using tools like deep research uh, on Claude, ChatGPT, or Gemini. You can even do some pretty decent lead sourcing there if the data is publicly available. Um, so you can kind of get the data, you can enrich it with different information, have sort of rich filtering around things like the sort of employee size, funding, et cetera, industry, and you can put them into these email sequences. And um, this is what that could look like. And so this is where sort of AI and automation come in, where you can have these large lists that you create, that you apply sort of personalization to based on what the content says. So you can think about it like we're creating a single sentence that is personalized as opposed to the whole email being personalized. So these semi personalized emails, where some of it is sort of hard coded and then some of it is dynamic. Um, you can use this in a way that it improves your sort of outbound quality. So in this case, this is an email. You can use this for texting. You can also use this for, sort of more kind of cold calling type of use cases. But with cold calling, it's sort of less successful in 2026. But as you can see here, this is a tool called Smart Lead. There's tons of tools like this that exist. Like Instantly is another one, but you can see here that you have these sort of dynamic variables. So you can see like the first name will get dynamically fed in there. So, if you've ever gotten an email that just says hi and it doesn't even say your name, like, you're not reading that. But if it's more personalized, you're more likely to read it. And cold email, I won't spend too much time on this because it's definitely like we're kind of in this dystopian present where outbound is happening. You can use this for Instagram DMs as well, and other types of DMs on social media. But it's a situation where the kind of data quality that you can get from this at least is a little bit higher. And so it's just to say that when you're creating these outbound communications, a 3 to 5% response rate is actually considered pretty good. I've seen people get up to like a 10 to 20% response rate. And just as sort of like a tale from the field, different types of uh, like subgroups and sort of segments their reply rates vary dramatically. So some industries have higher reply rates than others. I found that, for example, people in academia reply significantly more, even if it's just to say they're not interested, versus people in, say, like the venture capital or the private equity world. They like barely reply. They don't want, no, you're not getting a reply from them. And then there's sort of all the things in between. For smaller sized companies, you're seeing like C-suite, like upper management types respond more, versus if it's a bigger company, they won't reply. And then you kind of got to go more to the director level. So it's a little bit of a science here, but this is all just to say you can use this sort of placeholder variables to dynamically feed content. And then you can use AI on top of that to personalize the data based on either web scraping or other kind of algorithmic tools that you can apply. But this is great. These things can take quite a lot of time to do, but you can send sort of thousands of emails every month using this scheme. There's definitely, obviously, you have to comply with the Can Spam Act and be able to have people unsubscribe, et cetera. But this is an effective tool that we've seen people have a lot of success with, even still to this day. Okay. More broadly, I think a big sort of sticking point is kind of similarly to the results that we were getting from the survey. People are using things like Zapier, ChatGPT, et cetera. But there's a real sticking point in actual sort of pulling the trigger on a pilot project or doing something sort of firsthand. And so one thing I would say is that upper management leadership really needs to be on board in order for this to happen. You have sort of these shadow use cases where employees are using things like Claude no matter what, but just sort of secretly. So having an AI training program, having your leadership be sort of acquainted with some of these use cases can really help drive adoption, and getting people on board, getting sort of different layers of the organization, sort of middle management and beyond, also trained, making people feel like their voices are heard so they can feel empowered to have these ideas is critically important. And as these tools kind of continue to progress, you want to kind of continuously do this. So you've got this sort of wheel of training that can occur. So conduct live training for your teams, and make people feel empowered that their voices are heard. And that can be really helpful. Going hand in hand with that, just again, do the audit, do the operational audit before you actually start implementing things, make people feel involved. Critically, 40% of the group here didn't have an AI policy. So we could see here like about, you know, 39% didn't, and even 14% were not sure. And then another 14% were currently developing an AI policy. So have an AI policy, no doubt, because again, especially if you have employees, they're almost definitely using AI and they're just doing it in this sort of Wild West kind of way. So do this, have this sort of red light, yellow light, green light sort of functionality of like when you can use AI, when you can't, what you shouldn't put in it. Critically, ideally having a centralized subscription for your business is also important because then you can have kind of more detailed rules and controls about what they're doing with your data. Because for some of these things, like if you're using Chat GPT out of the box with a personal account, they will use your chats to train future versions of the model, which is obviously catastrophic for your business data. If you're dealing with regulated data, there's additional considerations as well. Where, like, for example, if you're working with PHI and you're like interacting with any sort of AI systems, you need to have a business associate agreement. And so, having an AI policy, having intentional rules around what your subscriptions are doing with data privacy and security, critically important to do. And this is sort of a living, breathing document. So you want to assign ownership to AI governance to a specific person or a team, so that as you're kind of doing these activities, they stay current as the tools and capabilities evolve. No question, though, that if you don't have this, it doesn't mean people aren't using AI. Okay. Okay, so now I just want to talk about a couple tools that are sort of more automation focused. I think, again, everybody's pretty familiar with like these kind of AI tools, or at least like a lot of these kind of large language models out of the box. But the sort of input and output of data from different systems, you can really benefit from knowing about some of these things. And so some of these tools are more what you call like a low code tool, or even in some cases a no code tool. They kind of are in different degrees of complexity. So I'm sure some of you have heard of some of these, but you've got things like Zapier, Make, and N8N. And these are like workflow tools where you can say like, I'm going to connect my email to this, and if I get a specific type of email, then I'm going to create like an entry in a spreadsheet, or I'm going to automatically create an entry in Airtable or whatever. Zapier, Make, and N8N are kind of similar in that way, where you've got these sort of workflow tools where you can have these systems talking to each other, and sort of a way to do integrations, even if you're not necessarily an engineer. And for a lot of businesses, this is good enough. This is actually like quite good for the volume of data that you're dealing with. A lot of groups don't have like a fire hose of data. A lot of groups, it's like, this might run like a couple hundred times a month, and that totally works. And so in that case, from a cost standpoint, it's pretty good. But for some of these tools, these first three, if you get into high volume, it becomes aggressively expensive, where you're spending, in some cases, thousands of dollars a month. And so having sort of intentionality around how you're designing these things is really important, because it can basically have huge cost implications. And so you might start with something like a Zapier, and then you might graduate into something like a Lambda, which I'll talk about in a second. Basically, this is a fictitious example, but let's say that you had 3,000 invocations of automation per month, or sorry, 3 million. Let's say you had something running 3 million times a month, which can happen. Some of these use cases that we're talking about, where there's lots of data going through it, like a legislative session, or like interacting with lots of different databases constantly to check for new information. The 3 million thing could happen. It happens quicker than you think. We had one client that they were interacting with prediction markets, and they were sort of interacting with their APIs every 15 minutes. And so it was running like thousands and thousands of times, just like 200,000 times a day. And basically, if you're doing things like Zapier, and you're running 3 million times, you can get into a situation where it can be about $10,000 a month. Not good. But also, you got to pick the right tool for the right job. Make is sort of a similar situation, where it's 2 to 3,000. N8N can also be around 2 to 3,000, but if you do self-hosted, which is complicated, it ends up being about $200 a month. I just want to acknowledge AWS Lambda. and Google and Microsoft have their own versions of this, but basically you have what are called serverless functions. I swear I won't get too much into the weeds on this, but basically these are tools that are meant more for kind of production use cases. It does require some coding knowledge, but it has a generous free tier, and it's designed more for these high volume use cases. So in this 3 million task invocation situation, you're still looking at like less than $5, in a lot of cases less than $1, depending on how much memory and time the invocation is taking. So that's all just to say that like if you're up in a high data use case, you really want to kind of avoid these low code tools and look at something more like a Lambda, because you will thank your future self and your future expenditures. So I made a small graph just kind of sort of the cost versus the complexity, and you can see like Zapier, sort of very low complexity, very easy to use, but it can be a much higher cost. Make similarly sort of a little more complex, but still like pretty high cost. N8N self-hosted, um, arguably more complex, honestly, than Lambda because of what I was saying, where you have to provision a server, retry mechanisms, et cetera. And so N8N, is kind of one of the hot tools right now, but it definitely can be sort of more trouble than it's worth if it's self-hosted, and still, relatively expensive, $200 a month. Lambda, complex, not that complex ultimately, though. Still relatively complex relative to Zapier, but rock bottom cost. You can run 1 million invocations per month for free. So yeah, definitely just something to think about, to have in your back pocket, depending on your use case, which can sort of materialize more from your analysis. I will just talk for 1 second about this. If you are using Lambda and you're doing these sort of high volume use cases, there's a design pattern where you use what's called a queue, and you go from your queue to Lambda. You have the data pass through the queue, because then that can handle retry mechanisms, failure, and it can do what's called auto scaling. So you have higher performance at high volume. Definitely use a queue into Lambda if you're doing this in any sort of production use case. This is an AWS specific thing. This is, the majority of apps are still using AWS, but again, Google and Microsoft have these types of tools as well. That's as technical as it's going to get. So kind of zooming out a little bit more, once you do start getting into implementation, if you answer these 4 questions, you're ahead of 99% of organizations. You ask yourself things like, what does success look like for all stakeholders? How will we know if it's not working? Having key success criteria where you can see how will we even know if this is working or not? How can we measure it? If there is a problem, who do we raise the issue to, and what's the escalation path? You need to have an owner for these tools so that if something bad starts happening, somebody can handle it. And then who has the authority to modify or shut it down? Critically important to think about these things when you're kind of going into implementation. You have to have ownership. This can be sort of specified in the project plan or in your sort of project charter, but it's something that you really got to be thinking about when you're doing this. Similarly, best practices for implementation. We talked about impact assessments. We talked about testing, but you want to go through this sort of 3-layer testing model where you do internal testing first. You sort of run it yourself or with a small team, see if anybody else can break it. Stress test it with real data, edge cases, and worst case inputs. You can also create sort of like dummy data where it's sort of based on real data, but it's sort of just made up. But put worst case use case inputs or worst case inputs into it, try and break it, et cetera, internally. Then with a small group of sort of beta users, test it out, see how they're interacting with it, collect their feedback, et cetera. Really go through rigorous testing. And then when you do release it into the wild, whether that's an internal tool or a public facing tool, build feedback loops to continuously improve. Systems should evolve as you're interacting with them. So things like like a chatbot that's on your website, for example, oftentimes you'll see, oh, somebody asked this question that wasn't in our FAQ, but now we're going to put it in our FAQ. And so you want to kind of have sort of culture of continuous improvement as you're doing these things. So enough said. Got to test it. Got to go through this multi-phase testing process. And again, if something starts not working, it's okay to recall it and kind of go back to the drawing board. But ideally, if you go and you follow this sort of testing criteria, you won't have to do something like abruptly recall it. And so we're talking about tools. We're talking about productivity systems. There's sort of different categories of things depending on how customized you want to make it. But these are definitely high impact use cases that we're seeing. Um, Couple more points here. We mentioned the operations audit. Not going to feed the fed horse on that too much, but start with low hanging fruit. You don't necessarily need to eat the whole elephant all at once. I swear I'm not going to use too many buzzwords, but identify those repetitive tasks that can be automated first after you do your audit. Make sure your tools are working well together before you automate workflows. So again, look at that end to end process and be like, am I doing data entry? Is Zapier a good idea? Um, so prioritize having the systems talking to each other. Do the testing that we just talked about. And you don't need to do all of this all on your own. Consider external implementation partners where it makes sense. There was a study last year by MIT that found that organizations that are working with external AI implementation vendors reach deployment and production 67% of the time versus only 33% of the time for internal efforts. So sometimes hiring outside help makes sense. Other times, if your use case is simple enough, or if you're just using productivity tools like Claude, you should be able to have it be done internally. Couple points here about sort of pitfalls and how to avoid them. Um, Number one, overcomplicating things. I think keeping your workflows as simple as possible to avoid unnecessary complexity is an important thing to think about. I can tell you, and I kind of said it earlier, it it can feel cool to create a workflow that has like 100 steps or that has like every single edge case you've ever thought of in your life, and those things can be nightmares to maintain. So keeping it simple at first, don't complicate things too much. um, in the same vein though, make sure that you are thinking about things in the unique needs of your business. So not having it be customized can actually be a sort of liability where oftentimes you'll see this where, we've seen clients where it's like somebody sold them software and they spent like 100K on some new software, but it's super rigid out of the box and there was like an 18-month implementation period. We've seen third party people selling things like that, and it's like trends moving away from that. You want something to be customized to your use case, and more often than not you don't have to spend money like that to actually have a customized solution. um, this isn't a cybersecurity webinar, but I think that sort of deeply, arguably most important thing is security. Security is number one. Your AI policy can help kind of touch on this of what data should and shouldn't go in to an AI system or to even certain automation tools. And you want to have sort of structure around sort of your vendor agreements, but overlooking security obviously can be hugely problematic. You see things like data leaks happening. So you want things to be encrypted at rest, encrypted in transit, et cetera. Principle of least access, authenticated users, and auditability. Have an audit trail for what people are looking at and doing. And then underestimating employee buy-in. So I kind of talked about this a little bit, but making it so people feel like their voices are heard, um, critically important. It's one of those things that different organizations have different sort of optimism and openness to AI tools, but on the one side, there's the whole organization, the leadership team is super like into trying to make AI be implemented. But then you also see organizations where it's sort of fractured. Maybe the leadership is into it, but maybe the employees are not, or maybe nobody is. And so oftentimes the human component is one of the hardest parts for implementing new systems. People get used to kind of the way it used to be, or there's discomfort. And so making people feel like their voices are heard early on through training, sort of surveys, group participation, it can really help avoid things like a mutiny or kind of low adoption. You see some of these like big companies that are like giving people bonuses to use the AI tools, and it's like that's not, to me, that's the design of a bad process. All right, so that's it. That's kind of the core of the presentation. I know we're at about 75 minutes. I want to open up the room for questions. And I think there is a question already in here. But yeah, feel free to drop some questions here in the chat for things that you're kind of thinking about, or if there's anything I didn't touch on. And I'll talk about this first question kind of first. How would you recommend governing AI use in a multi-brand biz so local teams can benefit from it, but the parent co can still maintain consistent messaging, approved tools, and brand standards across locations? So this is a good question. I think that number one, having the AI policy, like I mentioned, be sort of very clear on what people can and can't do. Having your chapters have sort of a heavy usage of like templates and sort of existing sort of non AI systems where they have procedures and they have sort of specific types of materials that they can use. And then depending on how you're structured, if you're like a Microsoft org or a Google organization, you can also actually train some of these AI tools to use consistent messaging brand systems. So you can create agents, for example, that do these types of things. And then if you're talking about kind of a ChatGPT or a Claude type of plan, having a central enterprise account and then having sort of access be used for kind of different groups there, you can sort of have centralization in that way. But I think a lot of that is more kind of procedural. You can get into some auditability, or you can have approval mechanisms where things need to go through a central approval layer, which you can have these things go through an AI approval layer even. But I would say, in many ways, that's largely a procedural type of question. Um, okay, so I think there's not really many questions coming in, but yeah, I guess we'll just have a minute for questions. And Gabrielle, if you want to comment on anything, I think we've got a few more minutes here.
Yeah, so I did receive one question. Is there now a tool that immediately analyzes a large book that is printed in physical form and not already in digital format? Oh, Rock, I think you're on mute there.
You have a physical book and you want to analyze that basically. Um, so there are tools that exist where you can analyze like digital information. I think that you would have to scan the information. Like you'd have to scan the document in order to do that. Like I don't think there's necessarily like a third party that's scanning things and sort of providing a centralized tool. There's tons of tools that you can use for the analysis. Like if once you have the scanned documents, you could put it through like a notebook LM, for example, to interact with it and ask questions with it. But there would have to be this sort of intermediate scanning step um, that somebody does at some point. We actually had a use case like that. We were doing a big project with a university in California where they had like thousands of pages of this historical primary source document, and we did have to scan it before we digitized it. But you can scan, extract, and then analyze. But scanning is unavoidable if it's just paper. But arguably, I imagine that upstream of that, you might be able to get like an ebook version of that, or like somebody has a digital copy somewhere.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. While we give it a minute for questions, I did just want to point out, I put a link in the chat to today's survey. So you will receive this in an email from us tomorrow. So if you take that today, you don't have to take that survey tomorrow, but it's very short and it's anonymous, but just helps us improve our enterprise university classes. So we'd appreciate any feedback you'd like to share with us. And then I will also share a link here if you'd like to download today's slides, and we'll send that as an email as well to everyone who attended today. And then just as a reminder, if you do have any questions for Rock, go ahead and drop those in the chat box now. We've still got a few minutes left, so we'll give it a bit more time to see if we get any questions. Eric, I agree. It was very informative.
And thank you everybody for attending too. I appreciate the kind words and the questions. We're right at the beginning of this, so definitely a lot of opportunity.
Yes. All right. I'm going to put that survey link in chat one more time, as well as the slides. So make sure you grab those on before you head out of the webinar today. And yeah, Rock, it looks like we're caught up on questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up today. Any final thoughts, closing remarks?
No, I just want to say, I appreciate everybody's time and attendance today. There really is quite a lot of interesting stuff happening. I know that the field feels like it's moving at a million miles an hour, but I feel really optimistic about where this technology is going, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity, especially for things like small businesses and nonprofits, where it's sort of giving people a lot more power to really do quite a lot, even with sort of less resources. And so, um, I hope everyone is leaving this webinar with a sense of optimism and, dare I say, even excitement.
We did just get one more question. Question is, what types of jobs or tasks do businesses most often ask you to help with?
It's interesting. So a lot of it is things like doing these operational audits and then helping them actually set up these data pipelines. The extracting data from documents thing is a huge use case. Intake chatbots, and even just things like helping them set up Copilot. It sort of varies, but a lot of the stuff that I talked about here, um, we sort of get a lot of requests. And funny enough, we're getting more and more requests for like leadership training and helping leadership learn what is even possible and helping sort of analyze the operation on that sort of business specific basis.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and wrap up today. Once again, thank you, Rock, for sharing all of this information. There's so much to it. Oh, wait, I spoke too soon. We have one more question. Any good resources you can suggest for making sure website content is AI digestible, since users ask AI more than going to a site?
Yes, really good point, and I think that you could do a whole webinar on this. This is what's called AI engine optimization. This is a really hot topic, and this concept that you're asking something like ChatGPT about something, and you're then getting a response that instead of going to the website, they're telling you firsthand, like talk to this business or whatever. First of all, on your website, you want to be creating content that's related to questions that you think people might be asking. You can do there's certain tools like HubSpot has a tool that does this, for example, but you can do audits of sort of what it's producing now, where you can ask it questions and see what it says. And then you want to create content on your website that's in that sort of structured format where it's like the question and then like bullet points of the answers, etc. But one of the things that again is slept on, but critically important, is if you can get what are called backlinks, so links to your website related to this content from other websites, ideally ones that are high authority. So like this ties back to the PR conversation. If you can get on the Wall Street Journal, or if you can get onto like a really important Substack, or something that has high traffic that isn't your website, that is actually critically important for AI models, because what they're looking for when they're looking at the internet and they're looking at deep research, they're looking for consensus. So if it just appears in like a Reddit comment or something, it's less likely to get hit. But if it appears in a Reddit comment and it appears on a blog and it appears on your website and it might appear, XYZ other places, it'll see consensus and it's more likely to recommend it. We're going to
Great.
release a
Thanks
blog
so much.
post on that too, actually, in like the next few weeks. So because we keep getting that type of question, so it's definitely something though it's a hot topic.